Will the traveler die? That may sound like a dumb question. I mean, no, of course not. They are the main character, they have plot armor, is what I would have said prior to 4.2. But now, I'm not so sure. See, we got the biggest, juiciest lore bomb to date in this Arcane Quest's epilogue. And now, for the first time, we have the full picture of Celestia and Neuvillette laid out before us. It's still blurry in places, but it's all there. We finally know what Gnoses and visions are, how they were made, what they do, and how they are given out. Thanks to Focalors Plan, we also learned that Celestia is far more structured than we might have imagined, albeit in a surprisingly abstract way. And that may just be what spells the Traveler's doom. So today, I will analyze and try to explain the entire history of Celestia in order to give Focalors Plan some much needed context. After all, going off the Arcane Quest alone, it kinda doesn't make any sense. And then lastly, we will talk about the Descenders and why we might have misinterpreted the Traveler's role this entire time. Timestamps are available in the description and the pinned comment, by the way. All of Neuvillette is a stage, or so Frina claims, and the scriptwriter is none other than Heavenly Principles. Nicole, a true visionary, knew that the prophecy would come true. After all, it was the history of the future, meaning it was set in stone. Though this may also be another nod at the fact that Neuvillette, as a whole, possesses a cyclical nature, as in, this has already happened and therefore will come to pass once more. However, Anne also let us in on a very important piece of information. Prophecies are merely the future as seen by the gods, but said gods have several blind spots and thus don't have access to the big picture. In other words, they can't predict what will happen in the future, but they can't fully predict how it will happen, as they can't account for what they cannot see. We saw this happen with Fontaine's prophecy. The 4 stone slates detailing the history of the future of the nation all came to pass, and indeed, the water levels rose, and the people's original sin was washed away. But instead of it getting washed away by the primordial sea while the Fontainians got dissolved, it was cleansed by Neuvillette granting the fake humans real blood, thus making them fully fledged humans. By remaining in a blind spot while putting her plan into motion, Focalors was able to bend the rules a little, even if she could not totally change them. Regardless, this is a crucial piece of information because it shows us that the celestial gods aren't omniscient or omnipotent. I have long wondered if free will is even a thing that exists within Neuvillette. If everyone has a constellation detailing their fate, then their every action will take them closer to that outcome, much like how our Fontainian group of unlikely friends unleashed the prophecy by trying to avoid it while setting up the trial. If this fate was decided by Celestia, they would be able to ensure the obedience of all their subjects, which they clearly can't. So either Celestia dictates a future but cannot fully enforce it, or they are just visionaries like Barbaloth, capable only of reading and predicting a fate that has already been dictated by this world's unique laws. And fate may not be the only law the celestial gods struggle with. I'm going to start a petition to change Neuvillette's title from Hydro Sovereign to Sovereign of Lore Bombs and Spoilers, because what the heck, Hoyoverse? First this ancient voice line that spoiled an entire patch, and now this. I'm going to read you his Vision's character story, and then we will go over it little by little, because oh boy is this just jam-packed with confusing information, so pay attention now. Neuvillette does not need a vision to manipulate the elements. However, there were some things he learned only after regaining his complete form. Severely wounded in a great war of vengeance, the usurper had their functions ruined, and could no longer use their absolute authority to suppress the original order of this world. To continue to subdue and control the resentments and loathing of the world, the usurper and one who came after created the Gnoses together. So it came to be that an order was made to be upheld, and thus did humans come to only possess the 7 remembrances, and all fragments of the primordial were driven to devour each other. From that day on, whenever a person's wishes reached the heavens, the 7 overseers of the material realm were duty-bound to grant them a gift. Though they might know nothing of who or what wish had stepped into the threshold of the sacred, the 7 archons still had to impart a shattered shard of their mastery to that person. And when one so gifted completed their duty, the gift the gods would receive in return would be more abundant still. Neuvillette obeys no edict from the heavens, but he does acknowledge human will, so he too sets aside parts of himself, as like unto the dragon treasure hoards of old, awaiting valiant humans to come and claim them. Being able to cram a patch's worth of lore into 4 short paragraphs is a power I envy, so let's dissect this monster, shall we? First and foremost, we are told that Heavenly Principles is heavily wounded. This by itself is not a surprise. We already knew that Celestia was facing a decline, with the Sustainer showing possible signs of corruption and Heavenly Principles being completely MIA for 500 years. But now we got something of a timeline. This happened during the War of Vengeance, which is likely the war with the Second Throne. The Dragon War consisted of an alien being intruding into the Sovereign's home and taking it for themselves by force. We have no indication there was any kind of contact between the Primordial One and the dragons before this point, so this couldn't have been about revenge. Meanwhile, we also have never been told that Heavenly Principles and the Second Who Came had any sort of prior contact, but they are both described as being thrones of the heavens, the same kind of being, so they may hail from the same place, somewhere beyond the Sea of Stars. And the description of the narwhal may actually support this possibility. It suggests that Teyvat exists within a universe that is just teeming with life, and the only reason why there aren't more alien beings making contact is because the Primordial One created the eggshell to protect its creation from the outside world. So, for all we know, the First Throne might even have fled to Teyvat to escape the Second Throne, who would have come after them for some kind of vengeance. There is also another possible interpretation for those who subscribe to the theory that Nibelung is actually the Second Throne, in which case the reason for its vengeance becomes crystal clear. Whatever the case, after this point, Heavenly Principles is no longer capable of carrying out its functions. Which is such a weird word choice, by the way. What are they, robots? Anyway, the damage prevented them from using this absolute authority of theirs to suppress the original order of this world. Such original order is probably referring to how Teyvat was prior to the changes Heavenly Principles made, but also to Teyvat's own unique rules, which might be what is meant by the resentments and loathing of this world. They were able to make these changes because, in Apep's words, in war the victor would inherit the right to shape the world. And what else did they inherit from their war with the dragons? The 7 authorities of the Dragon Sovereigns, which, when combined, would create this absolute authority with the power to bend the rules of reality to Heavenly Principles' will, thus giving rise to the universal law created in heaven, the divine laws established in the beginning, as Rukkhadvata once put it. But now they are no longer capable of wielding all 7 authorities themselves, so this new world and order they made is at risk. So a solution was needed to allow Heavenly Principles to keep its grip on Teyvat, and that solution were the Gnoses. They were created by Heavenly Principles themselves and one who came after. There are only 2 likely possibilities in regards to who this second entity might be, the Second Throne or the Third Descender. We know that the Third Descender is dead and their remains were used to create the Gnoses, so either the Second Who Came entered an unlikely partnership with Heavenly Principles after the war to save Teyvat by slaying the Third Descender, or the Third Descender willingly gave up their lives, choosing to be some sort of sacrificial lamb. As improbable as it might sound, I'm leaning more towards the first option for a simple reason. The Gnoses are said to be objects of misfortune, an Archon's curse. We know that when gods face death with hatred and resentment in their heart, they leave behind a sort of miasma that essentially behaves like a curse upon the land. Following the same logic, the Gnoses may be cursed because the Third Descender was slain against their will. Whatever the case, after the creation of the Gnoses, the 7 authorities were once again split apart, and a new order emerged, the Cycle of 7. At this point, we are introduced to the 7 Overseers of the Material Realm. This is a title that had never been brought up in the game up to this point, but I'd bet you have heard about these Overseers before. You see, the consensus among scholars is that the Archon War began over 7 divine seats in Celestia. I always more or less assumed that these were the Gnoses because, as far as we knew, they were the one thing that set the Archons apart from the rest of the Teyvatian gods. But that is not the case, and this is where we need to thank Focalors. So let's talk about her plan. In order to deceive Heavenly Principles, Focalors created a human version of herself, Furina, who was to rule Fontaine and ensure everyone believed she was the actual rightful Archon. This would allow Focalors to remain inside the Oratrice, which likely acted as some sort of blind spot, in order to collect enough indemnitium to put an end to the Hydro Archon, after which Neuvillette would take over and be able to judge the people of Fontaine innocent. The only problem? This makes absolutely no sense. First and foremost, Heavenly Principles has been real quiet since the Cataclysm and has not made a move against anyone who openly challenges them. Think about Tsaritsya, for example. She's not going out of her way to hide her intentions, yet Snezhnaya is yet to get nuked. You could argue that the entire nation of Cryo is a blind spot, just like Khaenri'ah appears to have been, but the Fatui are everywhere. It's not like they are operating from the comfort of their home. There is no way Celestia can see them, which means that they either don't consider them a big enough threat to warrant intervention just yet, or Celestia is so weakened by now that they can't interfere. Secondly, even if Focalors needed to stay hidden to pull off her plan, once it was done, there was nothing stopping Celestia from striking back. Like, oh yeah? You saved the Fontanians? Cool. Oh no, I seem to have accidentally dropped a nail on your nation, hoopsie daisy. And also, there is no way Celestia didn't notice Focalors' stunt, because it affected them directly. Here's the thing. Focalors didn't need to gather that much indemnitium to sentence herself to death. Gods don't seem to be that hard to kill. I mean, Havri was killed by her own human people. Granted that she was a weak god, incapable of claiming his divine seed for herself, but still. 500 years is a long time, and a massive amount of indemnitium was produced during that period. Did she really need to wait for that long? The other key player in her plan, Neuvillette, had already fallen in love with humans long ago, so we can't even argue she was making sure he would accept her request. However, it was never about giving up her life alone. The death sentence wasn't given to Focalors, it was given to the Hydro Archon. Focalors killed the very concept of the Hydro Archon. She broke the cycle of 7. Fontaine will never again have an Archon. And now, with Neuvillette's vision character story, we can finally make sense of the implications of it all. What Focalors truly killed was the Hydro Overseer. So, who or what are these Overseers? In order to understand them, we first need to pay attention to what happened to Heavenly Principles after the creation of the Gnoses. We are told that all of the fragments of the Primordial One were driven to devour each other. I believe these fragments are the Shades. Why? Because the Primordial One cannot create life. I know that sounds weird, I mean, they are the creator of humans, right? Well, not quite. Before Sun and Moon claims that the Primordial One and one of its shades created humans and many other life forms, but the description of Fontaine's glider attributes these creations to the Shade of Life alone. Despite that, the Shade had to utilize the Primordial Sea's life-granting abilities to accomplish this. They didn't possess the required power to do it themselves. And if the Primordial One had the ability to create life, you would think they would have created at least 6 shades so they could fight the Sovereigns one-on-one, no? It's not like it was a short and easy fight. Celestia could have used more firepower. So either the Primordial One ran out of power after the 4th shade, or they had to stop in order not to spread themselves too thin. I believe the shades are fragments, meaning the Primordial One heard the saying "divide to conquer" and ran with it. If they were splitting themselves, it would make sense to not create an entire army, otherwise each shade would have very diluted power. Heavenly Principles is a title that may not actually refer to one entity, but to 5, the Primordial One and its 4 shades. So, when we are told that Heavenly Principles was heavily wounded, it may mean that these 5 gods were collectively injured, which explains why all of the fragments of the Primordial One are now turning on each other. But this fragmentation could mean something very interesting, because the 3rd Ascender was killed and fragmented. After all, we have 7 Gnoses and all of them are their remains. It is entirely possible that this process resulted in the birth of the 7 Celestial Overseers. As for their nature, we can only guess at the moment. They might be actual living, breathing beings, or just a manifestation of the power of the Gnoses. In either case, they likely possess consciousness, as they are the ones responsible for ensuring the people receive visions when their wishes reach the heavens. Well, they were. The Hydro One is now dead and out of commission, which is why the task of handing out Hydro Visions falls on Neuvillette. And that fact alone is what tells us exactly what the Visions and Gnoses are, as well as why the Trawler is so important to Celestia. So let's start with the visions. When a person's wishes reach the heavens, likely through their strong ambitions, the Overseers are duty-bound to give them a gift in return, a vision. However, they don't do it directly. We are told that it is the Archons that have to impart the chosen humans with a shard of their mastery, even if they know nothing about this allogene or why they were chosen. However, A claims that she had no knowledge that Electrovision stopped being handed out during Inazuma's lockdown, so she can't be the one to impart anything. And if you think about it, neither can Venti, Nahida, or Furina. Venti sleeps for very long periods of time, and we were never told about Animo Visions only being sporadically handed out. Nahida was a prisoner her whole life, but Dendro Visions never stopped being given out, and Furina is no Archon. Focalors, in turn, was in hiding, so for her to give out Hydro Visions would defeat the entire point. However, 3 out of these 4 gods had one thing in common. They had no access to their Gnoses whatsoever. The Electro Gnosis was given to Yaimiko for safekeeping after the creation of the Raiden Shogun puppet. The Dendro Gnosis was powering the Akasha, and the Hydro Gnosis was powering the Oratrice. We already knew that the Gnosis were used to allow an Archon to resonate with Celestia, and now that finally makes sense. If these archons were in a position that prevented them from handing out visions, and if they had no knowledge about the process, then the visions must stem directly from the Gnoses. After all, these chess pieces are directly linked to Celestia. The Overseers can use them to impart these shards of mastery without the archon's input, so long as the Gnoses are intact. And what is mastery a synonym for? Authority. The Hydra Gnosis still exists, but it is now incapable of handing out visions, and I don't think that is solely due to the Hydra Overseer's death, because Neuvillette now hands out a little bit of himself, a little shard of his authority to these ambitious humans, and that's what creates visions, meaning that all visions stem from the dragon's power. And that also means that the Gnoses store the authorities. I mean, that makes total sense, right? Heavenly Principles had absolute authority, the combination of all 7 elemental authorities, but after being wounded and weakened, it could no longer control it, so it had to split this authority into the original 7, and since they couldn't wield them, someone else had to. So the Archon War started in order to find the gods that could hold the authorities and prevent the new order of the world from crumbling. It is possible that each god was only allowed one authority in order to not have power be centralized. After all, an Archon with absolute authority could likely defeat the weakened celestial gods, but even then, Celestia had to have a means to control said Archons. By having the authorities be contained within the Gnoses, they could make sure the chosen Archons were bound to the abode of the gods. And I wonder if the curse on the Gnoses was also intentional, another layer of control that Celestia exerts over the Archons. Since the authorities grant one the power to shape the worlds, they are extremely important, and if they are contained within the Gnoses, that also explains why Nahida believes that destroying one would get Heavenly Principles to act. But Neuvillette recovered his authority, and that didn't destroy the Gnoses, it just left it empty. And the knave knew that. She could feel Furina's curse, she was definitely able to tell that the Gnosis was devoid of the Hydra authority, but she didn't care. Which means that the Tsaritsa must have no use for the authorities, only for the Gnosis themselves. So what is the Gnosis' true power? The answer? Nothing at all. I'm serious. The Gnosis on their own are likely unable to do anything. Instead, I believe they are amplifiers. The term absolute authority seems like a very deliberate choice. It is possible that the power of all the authorities combined is greater than the sum of their individual power, so by splitting them apart, they would no longer be as efficient in suppressing the natural order of the world. Therefore, it would be in Heavenly Principles' best interests to amplify the power of each one of the 7. The third Ascender was highly compatible with all of these elements, so if only they could amplify them, their remains could be used to offset the power loss that comes from the split. But that's just speculation, right? Actually, no. The Traveler is the living proof that there are beings who can do this. When it was revealed that the third Ascender was highly compatible with the elements, Paimon couldn't help but compare them with the Traveler, and for good reason. The Traveler is not only compatible with the 7 elements, but with many of Teyvat's energies. For instance, remember how they were immediately capable of connecting with Irminsul? Furthermore, like I hypothesize may be the case with the Gnoses, they may not have any sort of innate power. We don't know the origin of their original power, but once stripped of it, the Traveler had nothing to fall back on but their physical and perhaps purifying abilities. And I want to point out that weird animal discharge that the jewel in their clothes did after they acquired the element. It's almost like they were calibrating themselves to be compatible with the elements of Teyvat, because after that moment it never happened again, no matter how many elements they got their hands on. The Abyss Twin being able to manipulate the power of the Abyss while the Traveler can't, yet, seems to lend some support to the idea that they really have no base power and instead can just resonate with anything and go from there. And from there they go, because the growth of the Traveler's power is not linear, but instead exponential. In Mondstadt, when they only had the power of Anemo, they struggle against a Hydro Slime. But add the element of Geo into the mix and they can now solo the 11th Fatui Arbinger. Add Electro and the 8th Arbinger says bye-bye. Keep in mind that they are ranked by strength. With only these 3 elements, they were able to defeat the Electro Archon. Granted, they were given a helping hand from all of those visions and ambitions. And if you add Dendro, they can now wipe the floor with the X6th Arbinger and newly made Artificial God of Knowledge, with only the help of the wisdom of the people of Sumeru and their Archon. The Traveler did not learn to fight during their journey. They already possessed the know-how, they simply gained the power to be a formidable foe. It's like, the more elements they absorb, the more their power is amplified, whether elemental or not. I believe the Gnoses work in the exact same way. and that is why the Traveler is in serious trouble. It is not a coincidence that it was revealed to us that Teyvat does indeed exist in a universe full of life in this particular patch. We do not know when the Primordial One arrived in Teyvat, but we do know that it was over 6,000 years ago, and that's a long time. And yet, in that period, very few beings can claim to have been able to enter the eggshell. Despite that, the Traveler didn't even seem to be aware it existed, which means it posed no barrier to their arrival. And that's very odd. Do you know what else is odd? The fact that the narwhal was able to enter. It is Turtology's pet, so who knows, maybe he helped it enter. But its arrival seems a tad bit too convenient. After all, it played a major role in ensuring the prophecy happened so that Celestia's judgment could be passed. So convenient, in fact, that I have to wonder if heavenly principles or some other celestial god allowed the whale to enter Teyvat. And if they did, could they have also given the twins free entrance? The age-old question in this fandom is why did the Sustainer stop the twins from leaving? At that point, the Abyss Order still didn't exist, and the Abyss Twin had no plans to revive Conria or to wage war against Destiny. The Traveler also had no bones to pick with any god. Had they been allowed to leave, they would probably have peacefully continued their journey across the Sea of Stars. But no, the Sustainer just had to stop them, which kickstarted at least 2 revenge plots against Celestia. Being a descender, the Traveler is Fate's witness, a spectator rather than an active participant, so you could argue that the Sustainer had no real way to predict the consequences of keeping them in Teyvat. But the same cannot be said for the Abyss Twin, even if their fate is being obfuscated from Irminsul at present. It all feels extremely deliberate, especially when you consider the quote on the Traveler's profile about what seems to be their destiny. The Keeper is fading away. The Creator has not yet come. But the world shall burn no more, for you shall ascend. I always interpreted this in a very literal sense, as in the Traveler and possibly the Twin will ascend to Celestia and take control of this world in some capacity. This seems like an especially sound interpretation because of another quote in their profile that lets us know that the Twins hail from a world that has been destroyed. While the English translation is a little more cryptic, the original Chinese implies that the Traveler is the rightful original ruler of their lost world. Once a ruler, always a ruler, I suppose. But what if we have been looking at this from the wrong angle this entire time? That Tsaritsa opposes Celestia, that is no secret, but in her own words, she wishes to burn away the old world, which in context must be referring to the new order that heavenly principles established, one we know is no longer as stable as it once was. So I find it very interesting that this quote chose to word things the way it did. What if the world shall burn no more, because the Traveler will be able to secure heavenly principles' rule once more? The Keeper is fading away. The Creator has not yet come. This first verse is likely alluding to the current state of the Shades and the Primordial One. They can no longer uphold the order of the world they created, which is why it is burning. Even more so now that the cycle of 7 has been broken and one of the authorities is no longer in their hands. In order to stabilize everything, they may be in need of establishing a new cycle of 7, and perhaps new Gnoses will be needed for that. What if the Traveler ascends to Celestia, not because they attain godhood, but because their remains were used to create these new Gnoses and new overseers? Those exist in Celestia, so, in a way, they would have ascended, right? 500 years ago, the Sustainer might have made a gamble. She might have allowed an Outlander who cannot be controlled by fate to stay in this world as a backup plan. She might even have stripped them of their power so they would resonate with the Teyvatian elements like the third Descender would have done before them. The Traveler might have been yet another sacrificial lamb this entire time without even knowing it. That said, they are not bound by fate, and their destiny resides in their hands alone. If they play their cards right, Celestia's plan may just backfire. You know, it might hit the Traveler's plot armor and ricochet or something. But what do you think? Is this why the twins were allowed to enter and forbidden to leave? And do let me know if you interpreted the structure of Celestia the same way I did or not, because there is so much new lore this patch, it's insane. So if I wasn't clear at any point, please let me know and I'll try to correct it. Anyway, in case you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, it helps a ton. My name is Blue and I'll see you again soon. Safe journey, travelers!